Nigel Scott, welcome to Weird South, and thank you for making time for us from your location in Australia. And since you actually are first returning guests, still for those who missed the episode in which you were, could you kindly introduce yourself for the audience, please?
I had a varied career. I started off in special effects, animation, making TV commercials. Um, and then I got heavily involved in e-commerce and financial services during the 90s. And from there, we did a lot of research into things like artificial intelligence in defense industries and telcos and financial services. So what you're looking at is big data projects, R&D projects around application of artificial intelligence. But again, we're talking the first artificial intelligence project was about 98. So I've been close to it for the best part of 2 to 3 decades. The last major AI project was the one I took to Hong Kong. Accenture invited me to the FinTech lab up there in Hong Kong, where I spent 3 months talking to the FSIs about the impact of AI. And that was about the time of the blockchain crypto bubble. Everybody was pretty excited about blockchain and crypto at that stage. So AI wasn't getting much of a look in. Obviously today the market's flipped 180 degrees and crypto is
Yep.
yesterday's memory and AI is front of mind.
Great. So that's actually the germane to the conversation I'd like to have with you on. I mean, the subject of AI is in itself such a big stew, and I would like to frame it to some extent so people who listen to us would be able to use that frame if it's useful to them to sort of navigate, like you would do with a torch, a super dark room with loads and loads of corners, and you don't even know the scale of the room. So,
Yeah.
the first thing I would like to do is pause because there's so many avenue that we could go to that are interesting. But I would like to start with this concept of framing using AI in this current inception of it as a tool to design overtone windows for people,
Mm-hmm.
um, useful or nefarious, in order to create, I suppose, like overtone window do, an acceptance of something. In marketing, advertising, which is, I guess, your big expertise, it's very interesting. But I would like to go there after. The first thing would like one step up, which is how do you think AI, as it is now globally, will start to possibly have impact on accelerating overtone windows of people's citizenry understanding of current states or facts. So that could be political facts, that could be information, that could be even scientific facts. So that's the first layers.
Yeah, I think it's important for the audience to understand where this technology gestated from. Its origins are distinctly military, and it isn't something that's just sort of emerged in the last 3 to 5 years, which is the popular narrative. The R&D on this stuff has been going for decades. And probably the bigger question today isn't what is it and how does it work? It's why has the curtain been pulled back and this stuff actually being allowed to go to market? Because it's fairly obvious if you understand the history of social media and wind it back to the Arab Springs and the early days of Twitter and Facebook. It's fairly obvious that AI had a key role in the emergence of those platforms as the future of media. And if you look specifically at Facebook, and you look at the history of social media prior to Facebook, there was a known limitation of the network effects around social media. And that was generally, it tended to hit about 50 million people. And it hit the wall. They just didn't get any bigger. And then miraculously, Facebook came along and suddenly billions of people have signed up for this thing. And you've got to wonder, how did they bridge that chasm? And based on what I was seeing at that stage and the experiments I was running, I firmly believe deep down that what allowed them to bridge that chasm was artificial intelligence technology as it's currently manifesting itself. And that is that the technology allowed the platforms to hyper engage users and make them feel that they were more engaging and more engaged than perhaps what they were in the organic sense. I mean, even today, if you actually look at the amount of time people spend with Facebook per day, housewives were watching more than Days of Our Lives back in the 70s and 80s. But there's no way Days of Our Lives is ever going to be a business the size of Facebook. And that in itself is an interesting investigation into how media is shifted so dramatically from the heady days of television, which were the 1980s, which were about the time I was making TV commercials, through to what we have now, which is social media, which, for all intents and purposes, in the 80s, people were glued to their TV sets, not only during the day in the case of housewives, but in the evenings, the whole families were sat around the box. It was basically a cultural fireplace. It was like sitting around the campsite. The only difference was the fire or the TV was the one sharing the stories, not the families. Today, we've moved into this blip media environment. And a classic example of this is obviously the time spent on a TV commercial back in the 80s. People would be glued to the box and they'd watch a TV commercial which would run for 30 seconds. The average dwell time on a Facebook ad is under half a second. And then advertisers wonder why it ain't working. Well, it's pretty obvious why it ain't working. People aren't there long enough engaged to actually take on board the message that they're constructing. And then on top of that, you have this whole issue of artificial intelligence being able to create bot networks, which is at the heart of the advertising fraud scenario, which is such a big part of the ability of technology to create revenue. You know, if you wind back to the Arab Spring and you look at that initial narrative, which was all about, hey, Twitter and social media was impacting and changing the way politics and how groups of activists organised themselves and people came to the streets and did all this thing. They had this mega narrative which was coming out of the US around the time of the emergence of things like Twitter and Facebook as game-changing media environments. Now, if you scratch the surface of that narrative, what you found was very few people in those Arab countries actually had access to the internet, never mind use social media. And it was totally logical that this stuff could actually change the world because nobody's actually using it there. But the mainstream narrative, which was being rolled across the US, was this stuff was game changing. and was the future of media. The great irony of say, post 2015 is the fact that the game-changing narrative of the Arab Springs, in which social media changed politics, actually came back to the US and fundamentally changed politics. And so for the last 10 years, what you've had is this chaos which was imagined to be sown through the Arab Springs narrative, actually coming back to the US and into Europe, and obviously with COVID and all these other things. It was the seeds which were planted um, grew shoots, but they actually probably grew in places they weren't. Well, maybe they were expecting that was what they would have been placed for. I don't know, but I do know that the origins of AI, and I think AI is a particularly bad phrase for the technology that's been developed. The origins of this technology were initially designed to take the fire hose, which is global communication, pump it through the intelligence networks, and then use this technology to examine conversations in real time to try and identify threats through the narratives which were passing through this fire hose. And so what you had was this brute force approach to analysing everything that was being said everywhere in real time, in the hope that you could actually extract something out of it which would be useful for the intelligence agencies. What happened with the Arab Spring was a flipping of that idea that you could actually investigate the fire hose into injecting narratives, and these narratives could change behaviours. And so what you had was essentially a branching of the initial use case for this technology to create essentially, it basically is take it. I mean, this was, if you remember what television used to be, the fact you only had 3 to 5 channels and they all had a supported narrative. This was basically the next generation of that idea that the media controls the narrative. The only difference was it was through contagions rather than reinforce narrative over a very limited number of media platforms. Because back in the 70s and 80s, you could essentially control narratives by saying, okay, there's a limited number of print magazines and limited number of print newspapers, limited number of television stations and radio stations. Particularly with electronic media, they were all licensed through government. Basically, you had to pay for your license. If you didn't behave, you lost the license. Therefore, you behaved. Now you have this fragmentation of media, which obviously the same struggles that advertisers have in reaching people, so do policymakers and people who try to shift public opinion and public behaviours. And so what's happened is the technology has manifested itself and evolved to the point where people who have got the deep enough pockets and access to this technology can actually change the way people think, simply by injecting catalysts which ignite conversations which essentially become mainstream, or what we call viral media or memes. Yeah. And if you look back to the origins of Facebook, the mainstream narrative is you have this magic founder who somehow brought this thing to be. But the truth is, Zuckerberg had mainstream business television access within 2 weeks of writing his first lines of code. Obviously, that's been lost on the internet over the years, but the reality was he was getting mainstream US coverage in the newspapers and television within weeks of doing it. Um, Prior to that, you obviously had Rupert Murdoch, his investment in MySpace. So when you start to connect the dots, it becomes fairly obvious that Facebook was actually a reaction or a political reaction to the idea of the foreign entity owning, at that stage, the largest social media platform at that time. So the there's a number of aspects to this. There's
Yep.
a political aspect, and then there's a technology aspect.
Hmm.
Both of them are interesting in their own rights.
Hmm.
And then beyond that, there's probably, if you think of it in terms of a triangle, there's a third element of that, and that's obviously the future of work
Yep.
and what this technology brings to the table in revolutionising work, if in fact it will do that. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah,
And then so we also have to situate to some extent the actors of this, because, or the players, whatever you want to call them, in the sense that if we're saying the players are the government or the military aspect of the government that's has funded blue sky research, for years and years and years until it's ready for
yeah,
distillation, accidentally or not, like similar to gain of function to some extent in virology. But assume also that, okay, so this is in every country. There's probably a version of this.
yeah,
The more powerful the countries, the more powerful that engine is. So China, US,
yeah.
Europe, I don't know if there is a single entity that's equivalent in that, or dispersed within different countries in Europe. But so that's one piece. Then there is the piece about this architecture overall of the political views, the social views, the social dynamic that leads us in a 1984 kind of Animal Farm consensus that does not exist, that's been completely manufactured, but that is perceived as organic by the users of the consensus. And then as a result of those situations, then what kind of life and work and financial environment would we have if that actually takes and it's not completely rejected eventually? As we can see, there's some crack in the whole things right now. You could see Europe is struggling. You can see US is in a cultural war to some extent, as well as many other things. But so these cracks, you know, what do you think the odds that this, just like Facebook, as you described it, gets wholesale taken in, and then we have to deal with the next thing, or that actually it is so strong as a boot in the face that it's gonna not go through?
Well, I think there's two aspects to this. One, I think if you look at Meta specifically and Mark Zuckerberg's reaction to ChatGPT, um, you can see that he considers the technology to be a serious threat to the future of Facebook, Meta, and the group of platforms that sit there. And if you go hunting for the data, you'd see that threat. You would see that at the moment people are spending more time with ChatGPT than they are on LinkedIn. And based on that current trajectory, there's a very good chance of next year they'll be spending more time with ChatGPT than what they are on Instagram or Facebook. And this is where that idea of the false or faux friends comes from. And that is, and even Zuckerberg talked about that, saying the future of social was people interacting with chatbots and these fake friends. The reality is, to a certain extent, it's already there. It's just that it's the vanguard who are playing with this at the moment. It's the AI consultants and the AI gurus and the people who have deep dived into this technology early. One can assume that if they're the vanguard, then the rest of the population will follow at some stage, because the technology is designed to be more compelling. Um, and it can be designed, it's basically designer friendships. And we're already seeing reports of mental illness and girlfriends and boyfriends. And obviously the next stage of that is to give it some physical form and throw it into some robotic entity. And suddenly you have a physical fake friend powered by this technology. But I think there's two aspects to it. As I said before, the question is, why is this technology being revealed now? And if this is what they've said you can play with because we no longer have use for it, what else have they got behind the curtain? Because obviously what's behind the curtain is far more powerful than what's being commercialized, because
For
that's
sure.
just the name of the game. This stuff doesn't magically manifest itself out of thin air. It gets tossed over the fence so people can monetize it.
So, what can we do? What can we possibly do at this stage?
Well, it's one of those ones where you say, well, obviously the cleanest cut is just to switch everything off, but that becomes untenable as well, because how do you mobilize against the technology which is fundamentally designed to bring people together? I mean, the technology does what it does, and it does it extremely well. It started off as a telegraph, it became the telephone, then it became the mobile phone, then it merged with the computer, and then media got involved, and we end up with where we are today. It's perfectly designed as a marketplace for communications. It comes down to who the ownership of that marketplace, and we've seen this with Google, and we've seen it with Meta and Facebook, and now the new player on the block is obviously ChatGPT. And it's a case of if it's almost inevitable that the network economies tend to go to this Pareto curve, where 3 or 5 entities own virtually 99.99% of everything, and everybody else gets left to hunter gather on the fragments. Again, if you look at the data around e-commerce, if you look at the data around software, even things like OnlyFans, if you look at that data, you'll find that the overwhelming majority of people playing in those spaces aren't making a basic wage. In fact, they're not getting anywhere near it. You've got to get right to the very tip of the long tail before you actually see people are making money. And then obviously you have the kingpins at top, which are your Googles and your Metas, which are taking the lion's share of the revenues which are going through the system. It's to be honest, if I had an answer, I'd be out there saying, "Hey, here's the answer." But I mean, I've been looking at this for decades really, and I can see the patterns, but I don't see how you can unwind the patterns. Well, if I was going to give you a simple answer, I would start by saying you'd have to liquidate the pension funds, because it's the pension funds who are providing the funding to
Yep.
allow the monopolies to become monopolies, because they're the only ones with enough deepest pockets to actually fund the losses like ChatGPT have. Somebody has to fund those eye-watering numbers, before the monopoly emerges, which it can then cash in on.
Mhm.
Um,
This is a kind of the Palantir story as well, right?
yeah, it's a Palantir. It's everything. It's Amazon.
Like
It's Sal.
Palantir is literally 17 years
Yeah,
of
yeah,
that
yeah,
brutal funding, and
yeah. It's all you can almost, if you look at the numbers, you can almost see this point around the end of the dot-com crash, where
Mhm.
companies no longer made money. You know, they there's a few like Google and Meta who obviously turn the dial around ad funded platforms. Um, but people running software as a service, again, their
Yeah.
losses are legendary. And then they get offloaded onto the public markets and then they fade away. They need to get picked up by private equity or Oracle or one of the Microsoft or somebody else. Um, it tends to be the retail investors who wear it's musical chairs. And at the end of the day, it's the retail investors who get to wear the final carcass, which is thrown out onto the market. Um,
So, so given this, how do you think in the West, because the application of these things in the West and in, for example, China, are somewhat different. Maybe not in under the hood, but in the experience of it, they're different. I'm not sure how different they are under the hood, but anyway, that's a separate topic. In the West, say two big blocks, Europe, whatever the Five Eyes, and US. How do you see this? What you describe as being this algorithmic machinery that has many many tentacles. How do you see that influencing um, the cohesion of these pre-existing nation state? Like we had Europe, we thought Europe was something. It turns out, like the Arab Spring, lots of things are fragmented in it. U.S. It's hard to say there's one U.S. now. It feels more like there's different fragmentation of politics within that. So how do you think that you envisage the next 5 years at the speed that we're going right now?
I think the only difference between the Chinese experience and the Western experience is the Western experience for monopoly is understood as a free market, free for all. Um, but that's largely a puppet show because if you look at the fund managers like your BlackRocks and your Vanguards who monopolise so much funding, and again, this is all pension funds which come up from everyday workers who are mandated to put money into their pension fund, and that money has to find somewhere to go, and inevitably it ends up in well, inevitably the bulk of the funds have ended up in passive market in investing, which is essentially your BlackRocks and your Vanguards pushing up the Fortune 500, or more specifically the top 10. And what you get is this scheme, which makes it look like everything's working perfectly fine, but really all that's happening is money's pouring in and adding another layer to the cake. The real game that's out there is making sure the cake doesn't collapse on top of itself, which essentially is why AI came out when it did. If you remember back to November 22 down to say mid 23, what you had is the collapse of crypto, and it had taken down the Silicon Valley Bank, which was the major investment bank for Silicon
Yeah,
Valley startups. And
yeah.
there was a lot of Silicon Valley startup money in there, whether it was founders or VCs or whatever. But the reality was that thing collapsed and a number of regionals started to collapse around the US. So obviously, the US had a contagion event which they've become fairly used to now because they've had a few since the dot-com crash. And they had to step in. And the best way to step in was a new narrative about AI and how it was going to blow up the world. And essentially that was the solution to, hey, forget crypto. That's yesterday's story. Today's story is AI, and AI is so powerful. All the kids are using it to do their homework. Lawyers are using it to win cases. And then you had Altman come out within a few months, well, literally within weeks of the Silicon Valley bank collapse, coming out saying, hey, I carry this backpack around because I've got a magic button to switch the thing off because it's got the potential to take over the world, which is a really exciting narrative. But there's a reason these narratives emerge, just like Facebook emerged when it did. These narratives are timely. And so I think there's a number of ways of looking at what AI is today. And obviously one of them is the technology, what's exciting about it, what hasn't changed. And then there's the why now. Why is something that's been, before Altman's, and you've got to remember, ChatGPT that we understand was version 3.5. So this thing had been running for 7 years, going nowhere, and then suddenly it was a miracle. It was like the tablets being delivered. It was biblical in its manifestation. Yet before that, every iteration of it was a damp squid. So what had changed? What had changed was the PR team had moved in and said, hey, and funnily enough, it was the same PR exercise that fueled Facebook and fueled Snap, and that is the idea that high school kids are using it to cheat or using it to connect or be sexually promiscuous, or tends to be a similar story, and that is the kids are doing it, so why aren't you doing it? Because the kids are obviously the future, and you need to be up to pace with where the future's going. The most interesting thing about ChatGPT for me, from a professional perspective, was back in '98. The first AI project I worked on was one of the telcos here in Australia asked us to build an AI desktop tool for GPs, so they could type the symptoms in and it'd come back with diagnosis, possible drugs, and basically a whole wrapper of, this is the problem that you've described. Here is all the elements that you need to consider to create a solution scenario for your patient. And now, obviously, I had all the test cases from that effort, which was best part of 25 years ago. And as soon as ChatGPT came out, I ran the same test cases. They gave me exactly the same answers that we got back in '98. And the reason it gave me the same answers as '98 is because it was trained on the same corpus of work.
Indeed.
And it's the same technology. Did exactly the same thing that we did in '98. The difference was we didn't spend billions and billions of dollars building that thing. We actually built it with a team of 3 inside 6 weeks. And I don't think we spent more than $50,000 building it. It was one of those R&D projects. The thing that's interesting is what changed, and that is we demoed that tool to the AMA, which is the medical association here in Australia, and the president turned up and a few others, including some media commentators. We showed them the demo, and their jaws dropped. And then the president just turned around and said, "You're not releasing this on my watch." And the rationale was really simple, and that was the trust between the patient and the GP would deteriorate markedly if the GP had to go and use his computer to find the answer to what we're talking about. Which, funnily enough, is very similar to another project I worked on a decade before that, which was we had a Japanese telco who invented this video phone, and they tried to launch it in Japan, but nobody would have it in their household. The parents, the older generation said, we don't welcome people into our house, therefore why would we want somebody in our house with a video chat? You fast forward 20, 25 years and now everybody's doing it. It's universal. So what's happened with AI, I don't think it's so much a technological revolution as a social revolution. We've become, because we've spent so much time typing to one another on social media, the idea that we can talk to random people on social media just becomes a logical extension that we can talk to random pieces of software, which gives us random or probabilistic replies. The experience really is no different to talking to people. In fact, the amount of bots which have been on Twitter for so long, most people would struggle to know whether they were talking to somebody human or not anyway. And so that, for me, is what's interesting about this moment. The technology, not so much so. I describe ChatGPT as the Babel fish, which is obviously that device in the Hitchhiker's Guide. In fact, that the single thing I found most useful when I did the test comparing 98 to today, or back in 23 when I used it, was obviously you had to have done your 7 years worth of medical training to understand what the machine was spinning back to you, because it was all medical jargon. After it had run it and mirrored what we'd done in 98, I then changed the question and said, explain to me what this means as if I was 5 years old. And the miracle of this technology was it actually did that. It took these complex diagnoses and turned them into Thomas the Tank Engine stories. And so what you had was this miracle of the Babel fish, this ability to take complex things and put them into everyday language which anybody could understand. And in fact, I'd encourage anybody listening to the podcast, if they really want to understand what AI is to go to ChatGPT and just ask that question, explain to me, like a 5-year-old, what large language models are. And you won't get a better response or description of the technology. Because I can guarantee it'll come back and say, I'm a super smart parrot. I'm a parrot who's been trained on everything that's ever been put on the internet. And I just guess what the answer is. I'm just very good at guessing.
So for people who are trying to think, right, so whether you have kids or not, but at scale of the society right now. So we know that this society is not what it was 20 years back in terms of we're now in a transition mode. We're not fully fledged into whatever the iteration of AI wants to start coding for itself, and supposedly the concept of AGI. But we know that this is a flux moment. Like we're circling, I don't know, towards the drain, or we're sending up, I don't know. It feels more like a drain circling. So I go back to the question that I have. So in your best mode of projection, given that you pattern identifier from many fields, if you were to draw a pattern of what's most likely to happen in Western society, just on the social part, and then we can go into the work part. What do you think that looks like?
I think the reality is the people I won't say people, but I'll say the entities, the financial institutions who fund this technology. Because obviously this technology can't evolve at the pace it's evolving unless somebody's pouring the money in to pay the programmers to do these things and everything else around it. The master the technology is serving is, at the end of the day, the one who's paying the bill. And that's what I said when I said if you really want to stop this quickly, then the only way you can stop it quickly is to liquidate the pension funds, because at the end of the day, money comes out of the pension funds, gets shifted into these professional money managers, and they put the money into these technologies. And the technologies have been designed to create conflict. And so they're eating the very fabric of community. But at the same time, community is actually what's funding its fragmentation, because the money is coming from the community to create this problem. So it's a feedback loop. So the simple answer is the community has to sit down and say, what future do we want? And is paying, here in Australia, we pay 12% as a pension tax to private money managers, and they choose to determine where the money goes. They have a habit of putting it into bricks and mortar, whether it's office towers or homes. In the US, they have a habit of throwing it into information technology. But they're also buying up homes and creating rental markets. So AI is only one fragment of this enormous change in the fabric of community. It is the most important because it's actually changing the way we think about what the future is going to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Um,
it does make sense, but I don't see.
the, 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 the light at the end of the tunnel isn't the idea of ChatGPT suddenly growing a brain and becoming something it isn't. The light at the end of the tunnel is all those other AI projects run by people who are doing it because they want to do it, not because they've got their hands out for the VC money and all the rest of it. There's the ones who are doing really interesting things with AI that nobody's talking about because they can't get any oxygen because everything's focused on this manifestation. That's where the hope is.
So, what's an example of application in this?
Well, there's the really interesting stuff is the ones who are creating synthetic life forms. Because they really are intelligent life forms in the sense that they're evolving based on the experience of the environment that they're working in. Does that make sense? So if we understand large language models in their current manifestation, what you have is this idea that you started information technology with a database where you stored records. Thanks to the internet, the database became a network. So many databases with many records distributed across many nodes. All ChatGPTs and the other large language models have done is sat on top like a large vacuum cleaner and sucked it all up into a box and then offered it back to us as a subscription service. So it's almost like paying for cable TV. The only difference is they're not paying for any content to be made. They're basically offering what's being made. So really, what you're looking at, what we call AI today, is really just a synthetic database. In its crudest description, you either have a database where people put in records, which is like your bank account, and so what you have is a database where the information that's in there um, is I'm trying to think of the right word. But essentially, um, it's a record of substance. You know, it's there to provide clarity. And the reality is, if you do a query into that database, you'll either find the records there and get the answer you're looking for, or it'll come back and say no such record exists. The key difference between that and ChatGPT is if you write your query, which essentially is what you're doing when you hit the keyboard, it will come back with an answer regardless of whether it knows the answer or not. It just makes stuff up in the absence of a record being there to source. Because at the end of the day, it's a synthetic database. So it's in many ways the antithesis of the blockchain idea that you've got an absolute record of to call back on, which is distributed. The blockchain idea was you have this distributed database of records which become the record of trust across the network. This thing's 180 degrees that. It's the idea you put everything in a box and it makes stuff up as it goes. So in the context of AI as it's being shipped today, it's really this idea that truth is relative. There is no truth. It just manifests itself in the moment based on how you've typed in words, how hot the processor and the systems are in the data center which this thing's being housed, and what it chooses to is the most probabilistic answer to what you've served up. So I mean, in that context, really neat piece of technology. It's true theatre, really. If you think about it, it's a magic act of amazing substance.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so, so I mean, do we think that the vast majority of the Western world is going to go inside that sort of version of AI that's sort of communism for the mind to some extent, whether it knows it's communism or not, or it's, it's just a centralized
But
thought.
I
It,
think
it,
I saw it going two ways. It's either going to go just like Google and Facebook, and what you're going to end up with is that magic long tail. And what you're going to end up with is a bunch of super users in every profession, whether it's legal, medical, marketing, film making, whatever it is. There's going to be these super users who are going to be so amazing they're going to become the Taylor Swifts of their particular profession. And everybody else will be out there combing the desert sands. Alternatively, what's going to happen is the technology, and this is what most of the studies are trying to show, is the technology is it takes everybody, no matter how low they are in their capability, and takes them up to this new benchmark, which is the average. Okay? But at the same time, what you're seeing is because all the material has come from the above average contributors, the above average contributors are saying, well, what's in it for me? Nothing. Why would I bother contributing? So what you're going to end up with is this the bottom coming up, but the top going down, and what you're going to get is this flat line, which isn't going to serve anybody really, because you've got to remember that at the end of the day, the LLMs are fed on the past. Their corpus is what is known yesterday. And so there is no future in yesterday. The future is in what you imagine it to be, and then what you make of that vision. And so the simple answer to your question is, how do you move forward? The simple answer is people have to have the imagination to move beyond this moment. Does that make sense?
It does. Do you think consumption and work are going to be a weapon for that? So do you think they can actually have the courage to move on from this stage by creating specific type of work or product or a new consumption?
When this stuff came out, I put together a few metrics, and one of the ones I used was the Eisenhower one, which is basically, what needs to be prioritised and what needs to be forgotten. My argument back in 23 when this stuff came out was the real economic benefit of ChatGPT in its 3.5 to 4 manifestation was this. If ChatGPT could do that work, there's a very high probability the work wasn't worth doing. So therefore, the highest economic benefit wasn't to employ AI to do the work. It was actually just to put a line through it, not bother doing it. And I still believe that to be the case. I think what ChatGPT and its ilk are going to do is expose just how much of the Western economy is actually make work rather than work that actually manifests itself and improves community. Um, and so,
Isn't it?
if you're asking me what I think this moment can bring, I think it can bring a wake up call that says, "Hey,
Mm,
shake yourself out of your slumber and stop imagining that you've made a major contribution to society, because actually this thing is taking care of everything you thought you were important at doing. So now go and find something important to do,
mhm.
because you no longer have to worry about that."
That to me
Taken
sounds
care of.
like the end of our current governments in Europe. I mean, I can't speak for Australia, but I can tell you for France, we are seeing the disintegration of competency at every level of government, if the ever it was there. I mean, I have to give benefit of the doubt that maybe 50 years ago there was some sort of credential on competency and willingness to actually manage things. But what you're seeing right now is just a succession of dunces who have been given or taken, I don't know which, the keys to empire, money, and lives and territory. And now AI can be a tool of that. And in parallel to that, there seems to be some community, as you described, that just said, you know what? I don't want to be part of this. I'm out. And that they're doing something which is useful to themselves and the adjacent people. I don't know how many of these people exist. Um, but to me, it sounds like maybe in a very big irony, AI is going to be the collapse of idiotic government.
Well, I think what it does is it brings into question how we do things. I mean, the obvious question that emerged from the, hey, kids are using this thing to cheat at homework was, well, if they're using it to cheat the homework, what's the value of the homework they're doing? But instead of having that moment of, hey, maybe we need to reevaluate what we're trying to do with our kids. I mean, to be honest, maybe it's a great thing that ChatGPT does do their homework, because kids can go outside and play. And then they might actually learn community and learn how to problem solve by working with one another to resolve things as human beings, working with one another rather than being intermediated between phones and software and databases and everything else. Because at the moment, it's definitely community intermediated through algorithms or algorithms. Um, ChatGPT, if we actually allow it, or LLMs and AI as a current manifest, if we allow it, will actually give people time and the ability to become free of this bind. You know, the make work activities of the Excel spreadsheets, the PowerPoint presentations, the Word documents, you know, the endless tax code. The reason these things have ballooned into the complex matter they are is because technology's facilitated it. But suddenly you've got technology which can actually get plugged in and take that away totally. Because it wouldn't matter how complex the tax code became, if this technology matures to the point where it actually can do what it claims to do, then the technology will take care of the tax regardless. And so all that make work activity which governments excel at, the regulatory frameworks and everything else, suddenly become redundant because technology says, well, I sorted that out. What are you having for lunch? Or what you're having for coffee, or better still, what you're having for breakfast. And so what you're going to end up with, if you take this thing to its logical conclusion, is you're going to have competing AIs, one which is governmental regulatory and one which is free enterprise trying to unbundle and work within those frameworks, essentially going to war in some majestic manifestation of five-dimensional game theory. Uh,
Game of
well,
Thrones into
yeah,
Game of
yeah,
AI. Yeah.
yeah. Um,
Well, I find that actually slightly hopeful, not because of the thing itself, the game itself, but because it will give us windows to escape. Um,
if the technology allows kids and people in general the ability to say, hey, I can offload this. And if I can offload this and use that time that it has created for me constructively, whatever that constructive means to you as a person, or more importantly, to as a community rather than as an individual. Um, because you've always got this tension of the individual versus the community good. If this technology allows us to free ourselves from the burden of what essentially is an industrial revolution mindset and construct to what the value of productivity is, what the value of human being is, what the value of work is. It comes down to what I've described for the last 2 decades as essentially these devices are time wallets. And if we can use those time wallets to release time and so that we can create quality time and lots of it, then the technology is fundamentally valuable. If what it does is tie us more to making work and eating our time, which essentially is what information technology has done since its manifestation in the 50s, is it's put people to work rather than work for people. Um, then it's just another burden. And essentially, it then becomes a question: is the burden the straw that breaks the camel's back?
hmm,
Um, I mean that's where that's the questions that I'm looking at, having been across this for decades.
mhm,
Is I'm not 20 years old saying, "Hey, this is exciting. It's going to change the world." Because I've already been through that. When I first started making TV commercials, it was the dawn of Terminator and Terminator 2 and Star Wars, and there was this great manifestation of computer generated animated special effects and movies, and they were game changing. And the speed at which that technology changed. The AI that we're seeing today, particularly in the world of video and illustration and those sorts of things, is at that level. It's from what was happening in 21 to today is no different from that shift from wireframe to ray tracing, which happened in the early 80s. It's just an exciting time to be in that space. But did computer graphics change the world? It made it prettier, and it certainly made the simulacra more compelling. But at the end of the day, it was still a simulacra. And what generative AI is especially profound at doing is making that simulacra almost undistinguishable from real life. And so what you have is essentially a technology which it fragments trust to the point that it becomes dust. Because today you can't go on to Twitter or Facebook or any of these social platforms and watch a video without asking that question: is this thing for real? It's got past that point. The assumption back in the 70s, if it was on TV, well, let's go to the moon landing because that's obviously one of the great conspiracy theories. In
It's
'69, when I
one.
watched the moon landing as a kid at school, it was obviously for real because it was on TV and everybody on the planet was watching it simultaneously. Today, you'd have 1,000 videos of the moon landing, they'd all be total simulacra, and your first thing is not is this for real, but is this fake? And what steps do I have to take to kind of verify whether it's fake or not? The great irony of Twitter, of course, is Groks came along, and if you watch your Twitter feed, the first question anybody asks is this fake? Tell me, Grok, is this fake? And so what you have is these new threads, which are basically people asking, is this for real? From an AI, which is adept at simulacra, trying to judge what's simulacra and what's not simulacra. It's a magic trick of it's a labyrinth of digitalia, I suppose. So, yeah,
It's Aladdin. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so Nigel, to conclude, I think I do want to make another episode just on the marketing part because I think the marketing for me is interesting not as a projection for consumerism, but rather as a projection from a tool to create a fake liking or fake dislike of a thought, an idea, or etc. So I think it's a super powerful weapon. And I think if people understood how it's used in marketing and advertising, they could then start learning how to decode this for social and political posting. But before we do that, and you better say yes, just to be clear, um, I would like you to give us a weird sauce about AI that you think would be useful for people to apply.
uh, I still I think there's two ways of looking at it. My first way is as I've done over the years as a consultant, and that is when you walk in the organisation, you ask two questions, and that is what is going to change, but more importantly, what is going to stay the same. And so anybody encounters this technology has got to frame it in those terms. And your response to those two questions will determine what you're going to do with this technology and how you're going to embrace it. Um, the, the, the other thing I would say is enjoy it for what it is today because it ain't going to be this cheap for much longer because those guys are bleeding. They're hemorrhaging funds trying to keep this thing alive long enough to try and get it to hit critical mass. Um, it's no different. I mean, I talk to marketing folk regularly about why Meta doesn't work for them anymore, and they've all done their Uber training courses. And they can all tell you about the various metrics and the dashboards and all this stuff. And I say, look, it really is this simple, and that is when Facebook did its IPO, the cost of buying a Facebook ad was about a tenth of buying it on television. Today, it's at least 25 times the cost of buying a Super Bowl ad, if not 250 once you've factored in the zero point 0.5 dwell time. So the reason it's not working is because it's too expensive. It's just the coin's flipped. It's now the most expensive, ineffectual advertising platform ever invented. But back in 2010, 2011, it was great because it was cheap. And AI is going to go the same way. You think it's good fun today for free? Imagine what happens in 10 to 15 years' time with what's happened with Facebook and the cost of advertising. Suddenly, what looked like a gateway to the future is going to become a chain around your neck, which you're not going to be able to afford to play that game. But the reality is, you're going to have to be able to afford to play that game because if it isn't, it will be table stakes.
That's Ready Player One in a, a different set.
Yeah,
The film, yeah. Well, Nigel, I think we have a date. I think
yeah.
that's correct. And you folks listening to this, I think you want to be present for that date. Thank you very much for the insight. And obviously, we're on that train. It's not a steam engine, but it's out of the train station. I think that's fair to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, so, as you say, enjoy, but more importantly, and I do want to make a small parenthesis today, as we are in September 2025, and we know that Charlie Kirk was killed yesterday, wearing a T-shirt saying "Freedom," and he was shot in the neck with a microphone. So I think on a campus, on university campus. So folks out there, feed your mind well, and feed your body well, and try to find a escape fire that has nothing to do with cutting off people or trying to make sense of stuff, whether you agree with them or not.
But I think that's the opportunity that's missing. That is the most interesting conversations you're going to have with people who agree with you.
Yeah.
They're the ones who are going to test you and stretch you.
Yep.
And you don't need to get angry around that. You just
And
need,
killing them is just simply
yeah,
not on.
yeah,
It's just simply not on.
yeah,
So thank you very much, Nigel, and be well.
yeah. Same. Thanks for inviting me back. It's been good.
If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest and stay curious about life.